So good morning, everybody. And there we had that thing. My name is Anna Maria Mailöv. I am the acting chief of the Inclusion and Rights section, and we are all very happy to welcome you to this first expert consultation against racism and discrimination, focusing on Africa. You will find there is a globe on your screen, and you can press on that globe in order to change the language. Today we have English and French interpretation. And I am now going to give the floor to Gabriela Ramos, who is our Assistant Director General for Social and Human Sciences. And she will be followed by a colleague, Mr. Edouard Matuku, who is the Assistant Director General for the Global Priority Africa and for External Relations. And then the floor will be given to our moderator of today, who is Mary Papaya. Mrs. Ramos, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ana Maria, and good morning, everybody. It's exciting to have you all here, Mari, and our distinguished speakers, and also my colleague, of course, Ferman Makoto. I really want to welcome you to this first edition of the UNESCO series of Regional Expert Consultation Against Racism and Discrimination, which focuses on the African region. As Ana Maria mentioned, I'm Gabriela Ramos, and I am the Assistant Director General for Social and Human Science of UNESCO. And this is the sector that is overseeing all the questions related to discrimination and to racism. We're very strong on gender also, but also social inclusion. And so this is very timely to get together to share and learn from you and with you on how can we scale up our efforts in this area. The expert consultation comes at really at a very important time. In the age of globalization and multiculturalism, the COVID-19 crisis has further unveiled the harsh realities of inequalities, with the most disadvantaged group disproportionately really facing the hardest hit related to the pandemic. We know that the pandemic did not have symmetric effects. The reality is that those divisions, those vulnerabilities, those lack of protection, and the discrimination that many groups have suffered translated itself again in lack of access to health systems, higher rates of mortality, less knowledge about the issues, less trust in the institutions. And therefore, we believe that now when we need to build back better, as Secretary General of the United Nations have mentioned, this needs to be core of the decisions, and we need to give priority actually to those groups that have suffered most. As the custodian of UNESCO's work to promote social inclusion in the fight against racism and discrimination, this sector, the humans and social science sectors, is upscaling its work. And in order to do so, it's crucial that we understand better the mechanics of discrimination in all of its forms, and that we address the critical data gaps at the global level in an effort to ensure science-informed decision-making. And given the lack of consolidated and analytical data in the African region, UNESCO has recently partnered with the Association of Canadian Studies and Metropolis to identify indicators to generate evidence-based responses that addresses the social and economic dimensions of the COVID-19 in the sub-Saharan Africa. So through these expert consultations, we wish to privilege a scientific assessment of the situation by involving experts to reach and listen to their perspective on racism and discrimination. And I'm very proud that it is with Africa, it is with you, with the experts, with the voices, with the knowledge of Africa, that we are going to start these global consultations, that we will gather the knowledge, and that we will try to learn better how can we push this agenda forward. And one of the most significant aspects in analyzing racism and discrimination revolves around the concept of communal identity. Urbanization has exacerbated ethnic grievances with the urban dilemma, highlighting the intersection between urbanization, poverty, and violence. Violence is another consequence of discrimination that has exposed society's flawed ways of thinking and uncivilized behavior. There are, for example, the striking incidents of heinous acts committed against people with albinism who are regularly dehumanized and killed. And I'm so glad that we have one of the most prominent, recognized leaders in this area in the panel. The example of the global movements against racism and discrimination carry with them unequivocal narratives of racial injustice, discrimination, and intolerance. And sometimes we have this accumulation of disadvantages just because of where you were born or the color of your skin. And so around the world, these voices might be different, but the narrative remains the same. UNESCO presents initiatives is predated by its already long-held stand in the fight against racism and discrimination and the promotion of universal rights for more than 70 years. I don't want to do archaeology, but the fact is that we continue to be proud for the declaration, not only the Declaration of Race in the 50s, that is our guiding mandate, but we work with Levi-Strauss and producing one of the seminal reports regarding race and regarding how these issues are really coming together. And it's incredible that 50 years after, we continue to bang our heads together to try to understand how to address these issues. The 59 members of cities of UNESCO Coalition of African Cities Against Racism and Discrimination represents also a unique city-level platform aiming to fight against racism and discrimination through the development of inclusive policies, capacity building activities, and advocacy initiatives. One of them is a masterclass series against racism and discrimination for secondary level students, and this Ana Maria has been leading in a marvelous way. UNESCO is also in the process of elaborating a recommendation of ethics of artificial intelligence, a first global standard setting instrument that will address the ethical and social issues related to discrimination, including gender bias and stereotyping, but not only that, including the fact that many of these technologies are really produced in a very homogeneous cultural way, and the fact that we need diversity, we need more representation of different cultures, and we need to ensure that the algorithms are not just reproducing what we see is a world that we don't like in terms of discrimination in the real world. So the COVID-19 pandemic reminded us how convenient it is to use the digital technologies to address the crisis that help us to keep the economy going, they help us to keep the society going. But the fact is that this, as I said, was completely asymmetric, and we still have now 3 million women that are not even connected to internet, and there is half of the population worldwide that doesn't have access regularly to these means. So this is another call of how unequal the technological progress can be and how much we need to push to get everybody included. So we look forward for being enlightened and inspired by the insights of our distinguished panel of experts and hear about the perspectives of the recommendations of the way forward regarding UNESCO's upscaling of its work against racism and discrimination, which also include the Slave Route project. I really want to hear from your views of how you see the current situation. What tools can we really upscale? What good practices you think could be analyzed and replicate and scale up? But I also want you to help us think how this wonderful international institution that I just joined could also contribute to this global effort. We are at the side of those that are discriminated. We are here for peace. We are here for human rights. And therefore, we will be listening carefully to your advice and your views. I also want to give the floor to my dear colleague, Edward Matoko, who, as Ana Maria said, is the Assistant Director General for Priority Africa and External Relations, to say some words of welcome. And then we will go with Mari. Edward.
Bonjour tout le monde. Good morning, everybody. Merci, Gabriela.
Thank you, Gabriela. Thank you for involving me in this event. I think that given what we've experienced recently in the US, but not only, it does seem that the time is right to rethink racism and discrimination. Briefly, I wanted to greet all the participants to the webinar, and as Gabriela has already said, I do hope that at the end of this meeting we can have recommendations that can help us push this further, both at UNESCO and on the international stage. As Gabriela has said, this isn't new work at UNESCO. Of course not. We've been working on these issues since 1950s. There have been statements, declarations, and conferences, the Durban Conference in 2001, for instance, on bias and racism. All of this shows that UNESCO it does wish and intended to tackle the issue across the board. When you look at the Declaration on Race and bias, we're not only talking about education or culture, it also mentions fundamental rights, inequalities stemming from unequal sharing of national resources. So it really is a cross-cutting issue. Now, we're talking about Africa today, and as ADG Africa, can I just say that we need to stop thinking that racism is foreign to Africa, so to speak, that it comes from outside. Africa has to look towards itself and look at what's happening within African societies and overcome the discrimination in these various places, all these things that breach social cohesion. I'd therefore like to welcome the fact that we have invited a representative of albinism. We incidentally have also celebrated International Albinism Day. Now, in the wake of COVID-19, a number of things have happened to these people suffering from albinism, and therefore there's no need to go beyond the shores of Africa to see a number of issues and problems. So I do think that we should look at Africa itself from Africa and look at what can be done to overcome anything stemming from ethnic or racial differences. Now, racism can be related to xenophobia, and I think we're familiar with that in our own countries in Africa. It's all related to issues of tolerance, of ignorance, and that's where clearly UNESCO has a role to play. So I wish you full success in your work, and thank you very much, Gabriela, for involving in this. Thank you, and have a good day. Gabriela, my pleasure. I'll give the floor to Marie.
Mary, over to you. Mary Papaya.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have two Marias, so I didn't pick that up.
It was Mary Papaya, so now it's over to you and to go for the panel.
Thank you very much. Good morning, and I am Mary Papaya. I'm the founder and executive director of Papaya Media, which is a social enterprise entity working with a range of organizations and institutions for the common good of community and country. I serve as the chair of Media Freedom on the South African National Editors Forum, SANAF. I'm also a change maker and convener of platforms of race, gender, and diversity. It is with honor that I serve you as your moderator for today. This edition is the first of a series of 6 regional consultations aimed to deconstruct racism and unpack the societal challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic that is related to racism and discrimination, and to give actionable recommendations to guide UNESCO's work together with its partners. As the series aims at providing an in-depth contextual analysis through a regional perspective, this edition will focus on the African region. We have with us a distinguished and illustrious panel of speakers who have generously accepted to join us for this consultation. Let me welcome Professor Vijaya Tilak. She is the professor at the Faculty of Social and Human Sciences and president of the Scientific Committee of UNESCO Slave Route Project. I want to welcome Mr. Sheikh Tidiana, member of the International Coalition of Artists for the General History of Africa. And I want to welcome Mr. Sanele Kaba, an international model, activist, and founder of the Roll Sleeves Outreach Program. Also joining us in a little bit will be Professor Rose Buswell, professor at the National Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University, as well as Her Worship Mayor Yvonne Akisoya, Mayor of Freetown, Sierra Leone. They both are running late. Our engagement today will not take the form of a traditional roundtable discussion. Instead, our objective is to encourage robust, highly interactive, and dynamic discussion with the speakers. Each speaker will be asked pertinent and relevant questions and will be given time to address them. Our speakers have been encouraged to react or comment on each other's interventions to allow for robust engagement. The panel discussion itself will last just under 30 minutes. Then we will also be taking questions from our audience through the Q&A box located on the bottom of the screen. The aim of this consultation and engagement is to seek and conclude a set of recommendations on the way forward for UNESCO. Therefore, towards the end of this debate, I will again be asking our speakers to share 2 or 3 concrete recommendations. So, without further ado, let's begin this discussion by asking a first set of questions that we have prepared for our speakers. They will each be given around 3 to 4 minutes to answer. To the members of the public who've joined us, please use the Q&A box to ask us your questions as well. In order to set the framework of our debate this morning, I would like to ask everyone these 3 interconnected questions. In your opinion, how has racism evolved up to the current COVID-19 context? What intersectional discriminations are emerging and re-emerging during the crisis? And lastly, up to what extent has racial and gender-based discrimination converged or raised its head? I will start with Professor Vijaya Tilak. Professor, you are the chair of the UNESCO Slave Route and a distinguished scholar who mainly has been busy with trying to understand the consequences and the history of slavery and indenture in the Indian Ocean. I would like to know, why and how do you think UNESCO should re-examine the question of racism today, and why is it important to think slavery, and racism is a kind of continuum as we look at these questions today. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I'm speaking very much as a historian because I believe it's really essential to see things in perspective when one comments on the present. I know this is a cliche, but when one doesn't learn from one's history, one is doomed to repeat it. Mauritius is a microcosm of many other countries in the Caribbean, for example, and of many other multicultural societies that have been born of colonization. We did not have any indigenous people in Mauritius. And one of our famous literary figures, Malcolm de Chazal, wrote that we cultivate sugarcane and prejudices. And 150, 200 years later, this hasn't changed. The situation is the same in the Caribbean as well. Slavery may have been the root with the population of African and Malagasy descent being the target of economic exploitation and cultural abuse in the 18th and 19th centuries. Discrimination continued well after abolition of slavery and continues up to today. But we also had in the 19th century, as in South Africa and many other countries, the introduction of Asian laborers from China and India. And you have another form of anti-Asian racism developing in the 19th century, particularly due to economic competition. Despite the fact that we live in a multicultural society, a beautiful one at that, our education system, our official cultural policy does not really address, has never addressed the legacies of slavery and of indenture. And this is the reason why in times of economic crisis and of other crises that are currently occurring, the system still cannot promote intercultural comprehension, and indeed, in a sense, promotes the opposite, maintenance of separate ethno-religious communities. And even within the Mauritian population, there isn't actually a consensus as to whether Mauritians want to maintain these official categorizations or abolish them altogether. So now with the COVID situation, I would say generally Mauritians and people all over the world cannot cope with stress. And this is manifested in displaying frustrations by pinpointing and abusing people of a different ethno-religious background. Internet and social media has contributed a lot to the spread of very racist posts and counter-reaction by those being targeted, those ethno-religious groups being targeted. Impact of COVID has been very harsh. Economic hardship has hit those who live off the grid, are not registered in any database, and there are many of them, and have never benefited from social welfare measures. COVID has shown the true extent of who is really marginalized in society, the extent of functional illiteracy in the country. And sadly to say, many of these are of Afro-Malagasy descent. And also sadly to say, many of those are women, because many, many households are of course female-headed by women. There has also been a backlash on the Chinese community because of course COVID is believed to have originated in China. People have been insulted on the streets. Fortunately, this has subsided in the last few months. However, I have to add something very particular to Mauritius, if you don't mind. On top of COVID, we had a very unfortunate major incident in Mauritius, and that was an oil spill. And that has affected a huge part of our southeastern coast and added to all the already existing economic and social problems that existed in Mauritius. So we have one added problem that we need to face with today. I don't know if this is gives you the background of what is going on in this part of the world.
Thank you, Professor. I certainly think it does. And perhaps we can come back to the discussion around the ethno-religious attacks and also the aspect around the women-led households and what are some of the very specific problems associated with them in your part of the region. For now, I think let's move on to Mr. Sheikh Tidiane. Mr. Sheikh Tidiane, you were considered by the late Manu Dibango as one of the most influential African musicians of our time. You played with famous artists such as Salif Keita, Joe Zwanliu, Ornette Coleman, and Wayne Shorter. During your career, you committed to fighting against extremism, against racism, and for the building of a plural world. But as you have been traveling the world and sharing your music, you've also oftentimes had to look at areas that particularly impact on what you're doing. So if we look at the impact of racism and the world, how do you think UNESCO can address this challenge? And how it can contribute to transform the image of Africa more especially? We know what is out there. We know the narratives that's out there. So from that perspective, how do you explain the gap between the reception of African arts and creativities included in the continent and that of Western art? Do you think that there is some element of structural racism in the artist world? How can UNESCO contribute to balance that gap through cultural policies? Thank you very much.
Well, yes, sorry about that. I'm not very familiar with the technology, but thank you anyway for UNESCO. Thank you for this lovely tribute. And once again, my dream, well, I have a dream, and that is to believe that all the artists of the world, regardless of where they come from, unite and build a true balance between the strength and the force that comes from art in general. There is indeed a deep discrimination that dates back to colonial times. You spoke about the slave route, and everything ensued from that. And in fact, even the music, the large musical trends, everything came from that period. We talk about world music, and I believe that world music, music of the world, is supposed to encompass all the different genres and styles of music. So I feel that it is discriminatory in itself to pigeonhole people, put them in different boxes, you know, because, well, classical music, of course, is something that European ears are used to listening to. And then there's other music coming from other regions of the world that European or American ears are not used to hearing. And it's that music that becomes world music. Now, why is that so? You know, why are we so lazy? Why can't we accept different influences and different structural languages? In fact, it could be all sorts of different sources. It could come from India, from the Arab world, from the Caribbean. So I think that that is the problem, and that is where the violent discrimination comes from. And in the 1980s, when I was telling people, no, you're trying to ghetto us musicians, and look at what you see on prime time. It's everything that is the general trend. And even when there is some African music that is presented, it is sort of diluted and presented in a different manner. It is not really showcased as it should be. So there is, of course, a lot of inherent discrimination. And over and beyond this form of discrimination, I would say that, well, of course, as far as UNESCO is concerned, I have always been asked to come and take the floor. I have been invited on several occasions. I have included artists from other regions of the world. And I think that what UNESCO can do is that it can really it can build bridges. It can build bridges to merge, to fuse the different identities so that everyone, each and every one of us can actually live and develop our differences and not the opposite, and not to erase them, but to develop them, because otherwise it's a discrimination once again. I see that albinos are also discriminated against. My friend Salif Keita, my dear friend, and so I would continue to say that intolerance and the fact that we are not accepting otherness, and the only way in which we perceive others is through our own fears, that is something that we need to fight against. We need to build a sort of a slogan so to acknowledge and welcome people coming from different regions and different walks of life without fearing them. You know, because wars in countries, even in my own country, is just due to ignorance. Most of the time, wars come from ignorance. And, you know, because of fear, people have developed tools to divide the country, whereas Malians have always lived together in harmony. But all of a sudden, the army has decided that no, there are different ethnic groups living there. So you see, discrimination exists everywhere. And it is creating processes that we need to combat. I have Tuareg friends who continue making music with me. So UNESCO maybe can define or design some kind of module whereby we can just all of us sit together once in a while. Why not drink tea in Algeria together, bring everybody together and create a multicultural platform without actually, you know, making any kind of ostentatious show of what we belong to or where we come from, but just putting everybody together on a happy platform. You know, after all, our ancestors discovered America even before Christopher Columbus, but it is not perceived in the same way, you see. Now, if we want to prepare an opera as well, why can't we do that? I mean, maybe UNESCO should promote us to do that as well, because, you know, Africa discovered America maybe even a century before Christopher Columbus, and we should really focus on the contribution of Africa. I'm sorry I'm taking up too much time.
Thank you, Mr.
But there's so
Sheikh.
much that I need to share.
Yeah, we will certainly come back to you. And I think the point about building bridges and promoting multiculturalism is what came through quite clearly, and certainly will save the longer discussion for another forum, I'm sure. Colleagues and friends and members of the public, please continue to put your questions in the Q&A. And I'm going to ask that our speakers please keep their input to the 3 minutes. We're now joined by Professor Rose Buswell. Professor, welcome. And you are an anthropologist at the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University. Through some of your work on new cultural practices, you have been trying to understand the continuation of racism in post-apartheid South Africa. Now, based on your experience in tracing the evolution and the transformation of racism and its effects on our identity, how do you think an institution such as UNESCO can position itself to better address the new forms of racism? Thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much to UNESCO and to colleagues for the opportunity to speak in this space. So my experience has been very much split between 2 countries, Mauritius on the one hand, where I was born and where my family still lives in the Southwest Indian Ocean region, and then of course here in South Africa for the last 2 decades or so. But my field research has spanned pretty much quite a few islands in the Southwest Indian Ocean, including Madagascar, Zanzibar, and the Seychelles. And so I feel I was quite intrigued by the previous speaker that spoke just before I arrived onto the platform. And one of the things that struck me was the fact that, you know, in the sort of Western canon, in Western artistic practice, aesthetic practices, we have a tendency to prioritize the visual. So if you go to a gallery or a museum, it is the visual that is actually prioritized. But if we look at the African experience, the post-apartheid South African experience, and certainly experiences elsewhere in what today would be called by scholars as the Global South, the whole gamut of human senses are actually invoked. We have multi-sensory experiences, and this is captured very strongly in UNESCO's Convention for the Preservation of Intangible Cultural Heritage, in the recognition that we have orality, that there is dance, that there are other senses that are actually prioritized and given space. And I think to address the issue of racism, we need to look at ways in which other human forms of expression, other forms of human expression have actually been marginalized for the last 300 years, how we have prioritized the visual over the kinesthetic or movement, how we have prioritized the visual over taste, over the auditory, hearing, and in a way prevented a whole range of human beings from actually fully expressing themselves and expressing their cultural traditions. And we can look to a new youthful generation that is emerging in the Global South, and especially here in South Africa, that are looking to ways of bringing these other embodied forms of knowledge into the public space and destigmatizing these embodied forms. And I'll just give one quick example. The one is dance. We know that even in Mauritius and elsewhere in the Southwest Indian Ocean, dance has been something that is stigmatized and often highly racialized. But it is a very important aspect of cultural expression. And so how do we bring something like that into the public space and make it less stigmatized, to put it on par with other forms of bodily expression? So that's just one little insight. Of course, there are issues of what we call aversive racism, which is apparently involuntary racisms, where that has been built up over hundreds of years and has permeated, discourse and ways in which to be in the world. And we have to continuously challenge those. Are those normal, acceptable ways to be in the world? Is it all right? For example, I mean, we recently watched a social media clip on how people were using jokes to promote racism. To what extent is joking a form of hate speech, and how does it perpetuate trauma and perpetuate stereotypes? Do we take these things lightly, and how do we address that? We know in a number of cultural groups, especially here among the first peoples of South Africa, known as the Kungsan, or the Khoi, as they're most politically appropriately known today, that there were what are known as joking relationships. And joking relationships were ways of actually bringing down or leveling social relations, so that you didn't have one person who felt that they were much better than another person in the community. It was a way of mocking the person, of bringing them down. But that was a joking relationship that occurred within the community. It did not necessarily look at external, people who are beyond the community and making derogatory remarks, which are hurtful and traumatic to people who are perceived or imagined to have different racial characteristics. So I think that would be, two contributions that I would make in summary. One around the issue of democratizing the census in UNESCO, using UNESCO as a vehicle to democratize the census, and destigmatizing other forms of embodied expressions in Southern Africa and elsewhere in the world. And the second thing would be to look at the issue of aversive racism and how it permeates social relationships and promotes stigmatization and marginalization still today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Buswell. You have summed up quite adequately the two recommendations of critical importance. We're now going to move on to our youth speaker for the day, Mr. Sanela Kaba. Welcome. Sanela, you are an international model and activist, the ambassador to Unknown Union, a label and fashion project that integrates local communities in the creative growth of the region. You are highly committed to fighting discrimination, and oftentimes you travel to teach school children about albinism. You founded the Roll Sleeves Outreach, a program that provides orphanages with secondhand clothes, school supplies. You collect uniforms, and you have a global influence on social media with tens of thousands of followers on Instagram and Twitter. We've also learned that you have accepted to partner with UNESCO on the masterclass series against racism and discrimination, and you are only 25 years old. So tell us, what do you think is the power of youth today in combating racism and discrimination, and how can we harness that power? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. I feel that it's important to have conversations about the past and the, and the painful and virulent histories, because if we don't understand, what happened in the past, and we cannot really advocate for, transformation that is obviously needed to address historical injustices or counter present day and evolving manifestations of racism. So I feel like I would feel that.
Sorry to disturb you, but we'd love to see you. You're speaking so beautifully.
Okay. Hi. So I would say that anti-racism would require disrupting systems that not only harm people of color, but also unfairly and enrich people in majority groups. I'd also say that many companies, many companies use superficial methods to gauge success that don't paint a complete picture. They rest on equal rights and equal opportunity without effectively tracking the outcomes of those tools. I would also say that organizations can increase their comfort and skillfulness in grappling with these issues with the right support, because myths, excuses, rationale for inaction, and are not unconscious, and they leave problem dynamics in place. And lastly, the mechanism for achieving equity is anti-oppressive actions, which range from celebrating differences, dismantling systems, engaging in conscious education, embedding equitable practices, policies, and tracking and measuring success. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That's I think you're raising such an important issue about policy, which brings me to our next round of discussion. And here perhaps the academics can educate us on, there is a gap in consolidated and analytical data, and not just in the African region, but in many parts of the world. So my question to the academics and the scientists on board is, how can we build an evidence-based scenario with data and research related to racism and discrimination in order that it will drive policy? And I'd love for there to be interaction between yourselves as well. So perhaps we start with Professor Tilak on this. Thank you.
I can speak a little bit for Mauritius. One of the difficulties of analyzing discrimination, or at least compiling statistics, is that we don't actually have compiled ethnic statistics in Mauritius. That ended a few years ago. And although there have been calls for this, I think in terms of official policy, they're probably not fully aware of how to go about it. A lot of the population has become mixed, and also people self-identify and not necessarily identify with perhaps what they originally were. So that is quite a tricky issue. But sociologists, I know, and many anthropologists have been asking for this in order to assess actually the needs and the level of discrimination going on in all sectors, whether it's the economy, recruitment in the civil service, education, failure rates. So people have been trying to correlate, in the absence of statistics, you correlate regional differences between particular villages or particular regions of Mauritius, where you do have concentrations of particular ethno-religious groups. So this is something that really needs to be done, kind of a scientific study. Dr. Buswell, I know, was involved in this many years ago in Mauritius, but it really needs, that was 10 years ago, we really need to update, because I feel the situation has changed for the worse.
So Professor Buswell, what's your sense about bridging that gap between what was done 10 years ago and now?
Yeah, no, I agree very much with Prof. Tilak that I think it's, you know, the data that we have is very old, especially in Mauritius, that we do need to update it. And I mean, I recently had a challenge where we were looking at, you know, a recent environmental crisis in Mauritius, and we were trying to ascertain, you know, who were going to be the most affected, you know, groups or communities along the coast, and it was virtually impossible to ascertain that because of, you know, the intermixing and so on that Prof. Tilak has mentioned. And I think it's really important to actually have that data, but how to actually tease out the differences between those who are self-identifying, you know, as a member of a particular group versus those who have changed their identity over time as a result of intermarriage and so on. And people who do not wish to actually invoke, you know, an ethnic identity, because there is a strong element of that emerging in contemporary Mauritian society, especially in this past year. If one looks at the South African context, because we have colleagues here who are also from South Africa and Southern Africa, in the South African context, we do have, you know, statistics that give us fairly detailed information still on racial factors. But the problem is that this data is actually very it's very numerically based, or it's very quantitative. And what I think we need is more narrative, more visual storytelling, the kind of work maybe that Sanele is doing. We need to have those narratives coming from various sectors of the society to actually articulate in detail and for a broader public what it is that they're experiencing on a daily basis or in structural terms. We don't have nearly enough of that, and certainly not in the news. If we look at the media, the formal media that we have, there is very little actual direct reporting on the consequences of apartheid, for example, in South Africa. We have an indication of violence and gender-based violence that continues, but we don't look at the structural conditions that have actually produced these kinds of traumatic, behaviors and practices. We have reporting, for example, on protests for services in the country, but again, there is no actual direct mentioning that. In fact, the reason we're having these protests is because people are still living in poverty more than 20 years after the fall of apartheid. Even if we look at COVID-19 and we look at the areas that have been most affected and continue to be most affected, we do find, and I think some research needs to be done into this, but the strong sense from some of the snippets of the news media that we're seeing is that it is mostly, again, the areas that were highly impoverished by the apartheid system and under colonial rule, and the racism that still persists, that keeps people in those positions of poverty. And we don't have, there is almost a reluctance to speak about, to bring the issue of race to the fore in the South African context. And a lot of it is also a little bit like Mauritius in that sense, because the issue of race is a potentially explosive issue. So people don't want to bring it into the public space because they worry about what impact that might have. But it's very much like a wound. If you don't tend to it, it's going to get a lot worse as time goes by. So there is ample, reason for, taking the initiative, for governments to take the initiative together with UNESCO and other related UN agencies to take this issue to the fore and say, well, why are we not talking about the fact that yes, race is still an issue in post-apartheid South Africa, and a lot of the structural issues that we're seeing today, the poverty and COVID-affected areas and so on, are as a result of the poverty that was engendered under colonial rule and apartheid. And we need to talk about that, because it also means, it's not just about the number of people affected, but even their basic access to good healthcare. And the kinds of daily sacrifices that people have to make because they have actually been kept in positions of poverty for, well, technically hundreds of years.
So thank you, Prof. You mentioned two important aspects, the structured form of racism that's embedded. And then you also went on to talk about the visualization of it and how it's played out or not played out in the media forum. And those talk to what Sanela was talking about earlier. And perhaps, Sanela, very quickly before we move on to some input from Mr. Sheikh, if you could tell us what is the youth formations and the youth position around these particular issues when it comes to race and how it's played out, particularly in the social media fora. So we can see you now, but we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Okay. I'd say that there's a lot of I feel like now that it's COVID, there's a lot of conversations that people, a lot of digging out that people are doing now, and there's a lot of histories that people are actually, that we're actually having constructive conversations about certain topics that I guess were taboo. So and yeah, there's it's, so I feel like it's now during these times, social media has played a really important role with having these conversations. I mean, yes, there are going I just feel that it's really important that social media is used as a platform to have these conversations, and people also say that and have organizations jump on board, I'd say to to have industry partnerships, for an example, that will pursue to make a dent in addressing these previous injustices.
Thank you very much. Perhaps if we can now go to Mr. Sek, let's bring it back to COVID-19. How have you in your mind, and I would like input from all of our speakers here, if we look at discrimination within the African region, how is it linked, particularly under the COVID-19 pandemic? How's it linked? How's it raising its head? And then also, what in your opinion is the biggest source of public misinformation surrounding the virus? And then perhaps talk very quickly, and I'd like all of you to make input here, is how has the COVID-19 been a vehicle for racism and xenophobia worldwide, but also touch on the gender issue as well? Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. When COVID-19 started and there were victims, Olus Mabele, Manu Dibango, among others, friends who were close to my heart, people who were important for the whole world, I started writing a text that is the suffering of the person under lockdown. I don't want condescendence. I want a fairer planet, more human planet. That is my dream. I prefer to be crowned with humility. The world we all aspire to is now undergoing its biggest defeat. Rich, poor, specialist, all of us, we are on our knees. We're faced with our limits. We are powerless in our suffering. There is silence. And it is said only plants, animals, and children will be spared. This is how I feel. But I think that even as far as China is concerned, there was discrimination against Africans. Instead of looking at this pandemic as a way of bringing people together, people, neighbors opening their windows in order to applaud medical staff. Why not do it without looking at ethnic origin? How can we not, as human beings, say, as it was done in Mali, we had this joking relationship. If someone is called Dupont and another one is called Angela, through history, there was this kind of jokes among them. And even at the time of conflicts, people would look at each other, recognize that they belong to such or such group, and they will start joking. And this humor helped to actually foster relationships. So we can no longer remain silent. Racism, well, we should fight against it. We should set an example. As artists, we can say that we will paint the same picture together. We want another world with playwrights, musicians. We need to educate people different, because education starts within the family, with the youth. If they have no direction, they have no idea, well, we should not be surprised when there are extremism, and we won't be able to check them later on. And because people look at each other and they only see the difference. And I think that this pandemic should actually bring us to challenge what we usually think. I think that UNESCO can actually play a role by saying, well, let's open windows everywhere in the world where people can meet, like temples, like mosques, like churches, where we can actually think together. I'm not speaking about uniformization. I don't want to do away with people's culture or anything. We should no longer be afraid to be together, because most of the time we actually keep to ourselves. We are saying, I am such and such, I want this and that. No, we only belong to one race, the human race.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sheikh. I think you raise an important aspect around how can culture and this culture diversity be concretely reconciled as well. And I'd like our other three speakers, bearing in mind that we want to see how COVID has brought discrimination out, but also give us some direction in how we can look at bridging the gap, but at the same time creating awareness and education. So I'm going to allow you to choose who would volunteer to go first from our three speakers. Perhaps Professor Buswell then.
All right, thank you very much, Mary. So I wanted to, I suppose, just talk a little bit, just for like a minute, just say something about the biological, because I mean, obviously, COVID is a virus that affects, you know, the human body, and one of the things that struck me, you know, when looking at how, you know, the story of COVID and who it affects the most. Was sort of unfolding, is the fact that, especially in the United States, there was this, the issue of the biological was actually foregrounded. So, you know, which, you know, what kind of bodies are actually affected. And quite clearly there was a sort of, if you look very closely at what is, again, being reported in the formal media, there is a sort of like what we would call scientific racism that is coming up. Again, in the narrative, you know, of COVID, and by that I mean the stereotyping of particularly racialized bodies as being more, you know, being more vulnerable to COVID. So people with hypertension, for example, in the United States, and large, you know, numbers of people who were hypertensive were also of African American descendants. And the idea that it's just basically the, you know, the hypertension and potentially also obesity that is, you know, causing, you know, these individuals to have serious consequences from COVID. The problem with that perspective is that people didn't in response to these articles, one of the things that emerged was that people were not thinking that it's just the fact of hypertension, you know, all these comorbidities that one has that actually makes a person more vulnerable to serious consequences from the illness, but the fact that the people were of African descendants. So especially in South Africa, and this is just from pure observation alone, it's not necessarily at the moment based on any solid, you know, research that was done, but the observations were that people developed this idea that this COVID is so the serious consequences of COVID are only apparent in people of African descent, and that those who are of European descent would have lesser consequences. So what one would observe then is in all kinds of public spaces, you would have people of European descent that are walking around with any kind of, without masks, you know, running, walking, you know, in public spaces, and the opposite would then be observed of people of African descent, people that were actually adhering to the protocols with regard to wearing masks. So one of the things that I fear about the COVID pandemic is that it will engender a new form of scientific racism, because we are now looking deeply into, you know, the impact of comorbidities and the prevalence of certain comorbidities in ethnic groups. I mean, like, for example, I don't know to what extent this work has been done in Mauritius, but certainly in parts of India, where diabetes, for example, is common. People are not going to be looking at the fact that diabetes is the comorbidity. That is the issue, and not the fact that it's people of Asian descent. So that there's a very fine line between this, you know, these ideas about race being put forward as, you know, the cause of illness, and then of course not paying attention again to the issue of structural consequences of illness. Especially here, again, the point that I made earlier here in South Africa, the people who have been most affected, and this has not been fully documented yet, are people who are living in poorer areas and who have been subjected to structural racism for a long period of time. Now, what can be done, you know, to address this? One is to actually have not just the kind of visual storytelling from ordinary people that I've been talking about, but also for experts to come in and to debate and to say, look, it's actually the comorbidity of hypertension, of diabetes, of obesity. These are all the things that are going to potentially make a person have more severe consequences from COVID. It's not a given fact, but we do need credible individuals who are experts in those fields to actually make those statements and to make them publicly in narrative forms. And one powerful video that I watched, and I think, you know, on social media you have some very powerful videos that you can you know, come across, was of you know, a story about refugees to the European continent, and how you know, the perception of African refugees going to Europe was that actually they didn't need to come to Europe at all, because they have a phone, they have this, they have that, they have resources. They're just coming to Europe because they want to have a better livelihood, whereas they can live back in their own home country. That is also a fundamental misconception. And what the video that I watched actually showed was that, in fact, these were items that these were the last items that people could grab as they were actually fleeing their homes and their communities, because those places had been affected by civil war and all other kinds of, you know, environmental and civil disruption. So only in telling the story from the other way around could you then change perception of refugees. And a similar kind of story needs to be told about COVID, to show that it's all kinds of, you know, people that can have severe consequences of the illness, and that you need to pay attention to the comorbidities and not to the imagined racial characteristics or gendered characteristics of people.
Thank you so much, Professor Buswell. I think the narrative and the positioning around how and the information that's put out is very important. So I have two last questions before we get to the Q&A from the members of our public. So Sanela, from your position, if you can tell us how we can inform and educate youth, and by extension, world leaders, about the importance of solidarity and the inclusion, particularly while young people themselves and people of color are recovering from the pandemic. And I'm going to give you a minute to do that. And when you're done, I'd like, Professor, moving on from what Professor Buswell said, if Professor Tidiana can talk to us, what, in your opinion, is the biggest source of public misinformation surrounding the virus? And how has that affected the general public's attitude towards the targeted groups? So if we can first go with Sanela and then Professor Tidiana. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me? Is it my turn to talk?
Yes.
So I read, there was a study that came out in 2016 from the IPS that said that it will take around 228 years for us to close the racial gap, and that's really huge. So I would say that, like, organizations such as the UN, UNESCO, should we need to track data, report data, contextualize the data, and because I feel like this is like one of the ways that it is constructive. We need to be able to do some. I think this is like one of the best ways for us to eradicate the issue.
Thank you very much. Professor Tidiana, we'll go to you now.
So you asked about the source of misinformation. I would say the guiltiest is social media, because it has allowed anyone, anywhere in the world to say things that are not really, doesn't have any empirical basis for it. And we also suffer from probably too much information, and that has made us not being able to discern which is sort of true, and we have some fake, of course, websites. We have many fake experts, so I think that has been a huge problem, and this continues. And particularly for a small island like ours, I would say another guilty partner has been rumor and gossip. Rumor spreads like wildfire. There has been an absence of respect for the privacy or the health data of people. We have people who have been infected, whose names have been disseminated throughout social media. They've been targeted, their families have been targeted. So I would say those two things, but social media, I would say, is the guiltiest feature. And I don't know how it can be controlled, if it can. But I would say those were, yeah.
Thank you very much. So we've got a few minutes left, and I want to put to you some of the Q&A questions that have come up from the members of our audience. One of the things that we have here says, is it possible to consider setting up a regional program to combat discrimination, racism in all its forms that were accentuated by the pandemic? And I think Mr. Sheikh mentioned that in terms of the artists and what role they play. And then also, if we can, the other question that comes up is it from the UNESCO perspective as well, a question posed to UNESCO. It says, UNESCO plays a vital role as an arbiter of knowledge exchange regarding historic and contemporary Afrophobia and its consequences. can the organization ensure increased collaboration between UN bodies, state parties, legal systems, and other stakeholders to eliminate racism and other forms of discrimination for a fair and just world? I think these were touched on by both, in fact, all of our speakers. So maybe just if we can elaborate on that, on what the public is asking from an African regional perspective.
If I may say something, I think first we need to see, although we are talking of Africa as a continent, there are different regions which have specific issues and specific contexts. I think UNESCO has been doing quite a lot of work, but it is a solid institutional body, and we need something maybe proactive and on a daily basis, a kind of a observatory that can be very dynamic and receive data on a daily basis from different parts of the world very quickly and process it and disseminate it. I think sometimes governmental institutions are perhaps very heavy and bureaucratic, and so the data and the urgent information that needs to be passed for action to be taken is not all, it goes into a file and sometimes may get forgotten. But if you have an observatory which is perhaps a bit more dynamic, day-to-day involvement of officials and liaising with authorities who can deal with issues, I think an observatory would probably be who can monitor things on a daily basis.
Thank you very much. I think linked on and moving on from that, and I'd like our other panelists to give input on this. Someone asked, are we missing an opportunity to highlight that discriminating against refugees and migrants, allowing privilege to flourish, is another form of othering? And I think Mr. Sheikh spoke about the other. And they say that as the issues that have left us with the active and endemic racism that maintains and increases discrimination, the systemic racism and prejudice and discrimination. So if we can have some input on that very quickly. And then another anonymous says, are issues of non-compliance with COVID-19 regulations a mainly South African problem, or is it universal? And then we move on to another question that's come up. I think that has been answered to a certain degree, is how do you perceive ethnic in Africa? I think it's been touched on, but if anybody feels they need to, please go ahead.
Je peux parler.
If I may.
L'ethnie, comme qui dirait, moi je dirais la pandémie.
Ethnics, well, look, it had been said that the pandemic would lead to disaster in Africa, to lots of deaths. Now, I'm pretty convinced that there's some kind of war or tit-for-tat discussion between scientists, experts, and pseudoscientists. And when you look at the numbers in sub-Saharan Africa, quite clearly we didn't get the disaster that had been forecast. Now, of course, there's discrimination against Professor Raoult or others, but I don't want to go against that. What I can say is there is much disinformation on the issue, that calculations also, those numbers are not exact. Now I can only speak on myself, on behalf of myself. I wouldn't want to speak for the whole artistic community, but it does seem that those countries who are most subjected to malaria seem less affected. I mean, if you look at the death count in Senegal or Niger, it's actually quite low. There might be 30,000 deaths in some country, but in our countries, it's somewhere around 100 or 200 maybe. And despite the fact that people are gathering, I mean, in my country, there was a real upheaval, popular uprising, where people went without face coverings. And I haven't heard massive numbers of people going to hospital. And I think that if you were to make information more democratically accessible, then that would be useful. You need to have access to all the information from all the scientists and recognize that no one is actually more legitimate than another. I think that if you start denigrating the statements from here or there, you end up discriminating in a way and creating a word where you have those who have knowledge and those who don't. Now, of course, we're trying to speak about Africa and racism here today, but I would say that from one ethnic group to another, there are also forms of racism. When there's no reason why I should agree with or support the political platform of this or that just because we're part of the same ethnic group. And I think we should really overcome these views. And I think we need to rely on youth to have a united Africa, a United States of Africa.
So there was the question about the issue of migrant labor, but we are running out of time. It's been such a beautiful discussion to date, and I think so very vital. So I'm going to give the rest of our four speakers to include the one question on the migrancy, Professor Buswell, but in closing to say, could you please, each of you, the four of you, I think Mr. Sek has given a lot of recommendations on how the artistic world can be taken forward in terms of UNESCO wanting recommendations. So can the rest of our four speakers please give us, Professor Buswell, if you can answer the migrancy issue plus give us your recommendations, and then Professor Tilak and Mr. Kaba, if you can also give us your recommendations to UNESCO. And I'm going to give you each a minute, please. Thanks.
Well, in terms of the migrancy issue, I think we'll stick to the point around changing the public narrative of migrancy. I think if we do have an observatory like what Professor Tilak has mentioned, we can have a more efficient and dynamic way of actually dealing with a range of issues in the region. So I would strongly recommend, the idea of the observatory. The other thing I'd like to recommend is the issue of political leadership. What COVID has basically revealed to us is that we have global issues that we have to, encounter and to engage with. And we have good experience in the past of attending to global agenda. For example, the many environmental conservation legislation that conventions that we have and ensuing legislation from those conventions show that it's possible for governments across the world to basically collaborate around issues of conservation. What we have not had, and what COVID has basically revealed to us in a very stark way, is the issue of leadership and the difference that sustainable leadership practices actually makes. to the evolution of the pandemic in specific countries. I mean, if we look at how New Zealand has dealt with the pandemic versus how the United States has dealt with the pandemic, not to point any fingers, but I think that we are well and overdue for a sustainable, what I would call a sustainable leadership convention that looks at all aspects leading to sustainable leadership for a more united and just world. We don't have that yet, and out of that could potentially emerge, a sustainable leadership convention, a convention that encourages those members, state parties who are signatories to the convention to abide by certain principles of sustainable leadership, which then helps us to deal with a range of issues. Namely to do with how we deal with migrants and refugees, whether we have a national asylum system. Mauritius doesn't have a national asylum system, which means that if refugees arrive there, arrangements have to be made by UNHCR to find an appropriate home for people who are designated refugees. So we need a sustainable leadership forum, convention, to ensure that those who are actually in leadership are not only held to account by their electorate, but also by a global collection of leaders who have the best interests of the world actually at heart.
Thank you very much. Can we move on to Mr. Taba, your recommendations, and then we'll go to Professor Tilak. Thank you.
All right. I don't know if my video is off or on, because I'm just having some technical Wi-Fi issues. So whenever I put the video on, I don't hear the questions. So if it's off, please excuse me. I would say that it's important to have on the immigrant situation. I feel like it's really important that there are certain policies that are put into place when it comes to inclusion. We have many issues. I mean, yes, we do have an economic and a job scarcity issue in South Africa, where South Africans need jobs. But a problem that I've found is that a lot of immigrants are in South Africa who have a lot of skills and don't have are not given the necessary resources or opportunities, which is a lack here in South Africa. So I feel like opportunities are needed for immigrants, because now you have the problem of someone who is skillful and does not have the opportunity to get a job. So I feel like policy is really important, and I would also allude to the fact that debating is really important. Our leaders need to engage in constructive debates, without parameters or insights into impact. I love debate. It can be used as a useful problem-solving tool in certain contexts. Debate although it can be offensive and a hindrance, it is a process that is designed to get us to an outcome. And sadly, many organizations allow for all manner of debates without creating effective guardrails. So we need to debating humanity is unacceptable and debating frames of analysis for racism and what's feasible for your organizational context, now that's acceptable. So yeah.
Thank you very much. I think what you raise is an important link with what Professor Buswell was talking about, and that is the Sustainable Leadership Convention, which talks to what you're talking about, and that's discussion and debate. And Mr. Sheikh himself also mentioned the areas around engagement and how the artists can be used. If we can have Professor Tilak give us your recommendations and way forward. Thank you.
So in addition to the observatory, which should be a regional one, maybe West and Northern Africa, and then South and Southwest Indian Ocean, an anti-racism and anti-discrimination observatory, at the local level in countries that have probably the worst scenarios concerning racism and discrimination. I think education system, I know UNESCO has given many guidelines about this, but I think there needs to be something more detailed, perhaps, better training of parents and better training of teachers. Just simple things like there are words that are not acceptable. Why are they not acceptable to use in a classroom towards children? So because these are the source of children's racist comments. It comes from parents, it comes from teachers themselves. So this really needs to be monitored, and this question of training is absolutely important. Cultural sensitivity training. And then I would like to support what Mr. Sek said earlier about creating cultural spaces that for everyone to be part of, not just dividing cultural groups or musicians into genres or categories. You need public spaces where the public can interact with each other. So this comes down to the cultural policy of each country. Some cultural policy, national cultural policies tend to encourage more division rather than unity. And I think these need to be analyzed and scrutinized by UNESCO. What are these cultural policies and how far do they promote tolerance or division? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. So your issue about the observatory, I'm sure, has been noted, as well as the safe spaces for conversation. And you mentioned the issue around education, and particularly getting parents and the use of language and sensitivity around that as being a recommendation. One of the questions that came out from the Q&A is, can UNESCO have at least 1 or 2 master classes for secondary students? And I think that's related to what they're talking about, the intergenerational perspective, to encourage youth in solidarity actions with younger children too. And I think Sanela raised the issue earlier about connecting the past and the future. And on the issue of master classes, I think Madame Ramos, in her opening statement, said that there was master classes held around some of these discussions as well. I've been told that Her Worship the Mayor Aki Soya from Sierra Leone was trying to connect now, but I believe that there are problems with the connection, so she's still trying to connect. Maybe UNESCO can guide us on this. Do we have time to continue with and take 1 or 2 more questions, or are you happy to close if the mayor's not back?
Yes, I think that we should maybe continue for a couple of more minutes with more questions. She's really trying to connect. So if the others are fine with it, let's take more questions, maybe 2 more. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. So I think one of the questions that came out here is the issue of non-compliance with regulations and the universal aspect of it. Is it possible for us to perhaps talk around that, and maybe Mr. Sheikh, get your view on what are some of the linkages in terms of the understanding of COVID-19 from a country-to-country perspective? If we can share the South African position, and we'll have input from Professor Buswell on that as well.
Oui, et moi je dirais que
well, this is what I would say. I would say that this pandemic, and I said it earlier as well, I'd just like to come back to immigrants and refugees. And the idea is that we shouldn't perceive the immigrant or a refugee as being someone who has run away from war or persecution or whatever. I think that the world is very imbalanced. There is a very unequal distribution of wealth. There is a lot of corruption. and they risk their lives to leave their countries. Let us not forget that. Even artists, in fact, have risked their lives to leave their countries. But to come back to your last question, I would say that yes, masterclasses seem to be a good idea, but without really deciding whether they should be aimed at young people or old people. Let us not divide people into different groups. Let them all come together, because everyone has a lot to learn. Every generation has something to learn from the other generation in both directions. So we have a biennale, for instance, in my country. Why don't we have such a biennale, an artistic biennale, under the initiative of UNESCO? Something global, maybe once every 2 years or even 4 years, like the Football World Cup. Why not? Something that is of a universal cultural nature, bringing together all 5 continents. You know, 10 to 20 artists from each country. They can be musicians, they can be from the fine arts world, they can be from performing arts, whatever. Bring them all together and speak out against all forms of racism and discrimination, and to create social cohesion. Social cohesion doesn't, speaking about it is not enough. One needs actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sheikh. I think that relates to one of the questions that was posed. Your answer and your feedback on the need for social cohesion. One of the questions was, how can UNESCO play a greater role in ensuring that the international frameworks, referring to Agenda 2063, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and the International Decade for People of African Descent, how can UNESCO play that role to reduce racism and discrimination globally? So if we can have feedback then from either of the professors or Sanela. I see that Professor Buswell's not on. Professor Tilak, can we perhaps hear from you? Because we've been given another few minutes to continue.
You wanted views on what exactly?
Basically, the question is based on, moving on from what Mr. Sheikh said, the question that's come through is perhaps how can UNESCO play a greater role in ensuring that the international frameworks that are employed by state parties can be used to reduce racism and discrimination globally. I think they're referring here to the achievement of the Agenda 2063, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and the International Decade of People of African Descent.
Well, we're now, I think, halfway through the decade. I think an assessment is really required of how far we have of what we have achieved in this UN decade for peoples of African descent. And I'm not sure the bilan, as they say in French, is that good. We're nowhere near achieving those goals. And I think we really need to redirect and understand why we have not achieved them. I really think the civil society needs to be much more involved. Sometimes in the assessment of these goals, these are perhaps made by people in government and do not really include the views of the population or of academics or musicians, the artists, and civil NGOs often are not heard at all. So you really need a kind of a more holistic and covering all sections of the population, rather than limiting. UNESCO should not limit itself from receiving feedback only from authorities, but try and include other groups in society, the other sectors of society. That's really important. As I said, we're halfway through. It is really time to take stock and redirect our energies.
Exactly.
Thank you very much. So Professor Buswell and Sanela, I'm going to give you each 30 seconds to quickly wrap up, and then we'll hand back to Anna Maria to close.
I'd like to just add that I don't know if I said it earlier, but I feel that cross-industry partnerships could help with this. I feel we need to also ensure that there's opportunities also important. Like I'm also going to allude to that. I feel like that is just one of the ways that we can address this this problem is and also inclusion, as Professor said earlier, where we can have individuals and not just organizations, because I guess sometimes organizations just have the icing at the top, and obviously I'll say that we need to have individuals partake in these conversations, and like I said, cross-industry partnerships could really help with this to close this gap.
Thank you, Professor Boswell.
Thank you. So my brief contribution is that if we look at Agenda 2063 and also the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, we need to have concrete goals, not just in those documents, but also sort of actual practical projects that actually emerge from those agendas that are implemented at the national level. For example, Agenda 2063 talks about gender equality and gender empowerment, and it talks about more just societies. So what we need to see there is potentially the investment that is coming, through the proponents of these agendas at the national level for projects to be implemented with youth groups, with women's groups, in order to ensure that those recommendations are actually being implemented on the ground. Because at the moment, the documents are just sitting in a way, in a space where they are valuable documents, but to what extent are they implementable? That is my question. Those goals, to what extent are those goals actually implementable? We're not seeing the translation of those documents into practical projects on the ground, and we need to start seeing these. As Prof. Tilaka says, we're already halfway through the UN decade that recognizes the contribution of people of the African diaspora, and we are soon going to be entering the UN decade for indigenous languages. We need to see practical projects basically flowing from that in the national and local or regional space, so that the goals and the aims can be implemented.
Thank you, Professor Boswell. We were going to end, but I see that Her Worship Mayor Aki Sawyer has joined us. Mayor, if you're there, welcome. In 2014, in Sierra Leone, your team successfully led the team of the President's recovery priorities in the context of the Ebola outbreak, of which you were awarded the Presidential Gold Medal and an Order of the British Empire by the Queen of England. Let me ask you, what institutional structures and effective policies can contribute to the fight against these discriminations as we are discussing? And I'm not sure if you caught onto that, and perhaps what policy options are available to guarantee inclusive and whole of community approaches to prevent discrimination, including racial and gender-based discrimination. Welcome and thank you for joining us. Mayor, we can't seem to hear you on this end. Sorry, Mayor, I think you might still be offline.
Toujours pas de son.
No, we can't hear you, Mayor. Can we ask technical to intervene, perhaps? Not. I'm going to ask if technical can't, maybe we hand to Anna Maria to...
No, I can't intervene
Yeah.
in the distance. You know, it's up to him to connect himself with the audio device, and it's on his computer.
Okay.
He has to, or her computer. Sorry.
I'm going to try one more time. Mayor, can you hear us? We can't pick you up. Yeah, but we can't seem to hear you.
I guess.
I'm so sorry about that, Mayor. So, ladies and gentlemen and guests, I want to thank all of our speakers. It's been an incredible discussion, so much of insight shared. And I now want to hand over to Anna Maria Malov. And she's, and in thanking everybody, I want to say it's been an incredible conversation. Anna Maria, thank you for the opportunity. And as Chief of AI of the Inclusion and Rights section at UNESCO, I'm now going to hand over to you to deliver our concluding remarks. Thanks to our panelists once again.
Thank you very, very much, Mary, Vijaya, Rose, and also Yvonne, who tried to connect, and Sheikh Tidiana and Sanele. I have to say that this was an amazing first regional expert consultation focusing on Africa. Thank you very much for your very in-depth analysis and forward-looking and innovative recommendations. Also from the audience, thank you for your very, very good questions. You provided us on a topic that is really of primary importance for all of us, not only for UNESCO, and especially in the current context. You can be sure that we will continue and reinforce our collaboration with all of us as soon as this webinar is over. As Mrs. Ramos correctly said in the beginning, this consultation and also those that will follow in other regions will actually allow UNESCO to better understand which kind of policies and structures are needed to better fight racism and discrimination. And this also, of course, includes gender-based discrimination. To what extent slavery and racism are intertwined, and the evolution of racism and its effects on our society and our identity today. The importance of promoting African culture as a mean to combat racism was also raised, and of course, the very important role of young women and men. And finally, all of you mentioned also the urgent need to fill the data and information gap, not only in Africa, but also as well in other regions, again, within the current context. So your recommendations and the questions that were asked by the very engaged audience will actually guide the work of UNESCO and our partners in the future. So I will stop here, and I would like to thank all of you once again and wishing you a great day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye. Have a nice and a safe day now.
Safe, everybody. Thank you. Thanks. It's been an honor. Thanks.
Thank you.